Good afternoon. My name is Charles Waldheim, and it's my pleasure to serve as the John Irving Professor of Landscape Architecture at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. We're so glad you could join us this afternoon in this space, Cape Ann Conversations. We're joined today by my colleague, Sarah Page. Sarah and I work through the research group, the Office for Urbanization at the Design School, where we're engaging communities both around the country and around the world with questions around the future of the built environment, and in particular with respect to climate adaptation and resilience planning. This series is one of a series of initiatives that we've been engaged with over the past several years with folks on Cape Ann, that's Gloucester, the North Shore of Massachusetts, and Cape Ann fitting into a broader ecology of the Gulf of Maine more broadly. As a part of that work, we've been engaged in scenario planning and helping to think about the future of a changing climate and a changing built environment in the context of Gloucester and Rockport and Essex and Manchester by the Sea. And as an adjunct to that work, we've framed this series in order to be able to invite leading voices on a range of topics attended to climate resilience planning and adaptation. And it's in this context that we thought it would be really essential to hear from our friends at SCAPE Studio. SCAPE is an interdisciplinary landscape architecture and urban design studio based in New York. It was founded in 2007 by Kate Orff, and with authorship over the past decades, SCAPE has emerged as among the most significant practices of landscape architecture and urban design in North America, particularly with a focus on the adaptation of natural systems, green infrastructure, the relationships between the human and the non-human, and in particular, resilience planning and climate adaptation. We're very pleased to be joined today by Laura Marett and Pippa Brashear, both in leadership roles at SCAPE. Pippa Brashear is a landscape architect, resilience principal, and a partner at SCAPE. She's been involved in a range of SCAPE projects, beginning with Living Breakwaters back in the day through more recently their Resilient Boston Harbor Vision Plan, among other things. Laura Marett is Director of Landscape Planning at SCAPE and works on a range of both planning and built work across the US. Both Pippa and Laura are graduates of the Landscape Architecture program at the GSD, as well as graduates of Harvard College. So Laura, Pippa, thank you so very much for being with us and sharing some of your work.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us. With that, I'll just dive in. We're really excited to be here and share some of our expertise and hopefully engage in a real dialogue and conversation about designing for climate adaptation with a focus on natural and nature-based and ecological infrastructure. So a little bit about us. Charles, thank you for the intro. Oops, got to make sure I can advance my slides here. That works. SCAPE is a landscape architecture practice, but we really are an interdisciplinary practice. In addition to kind of collaborating and working across disciplines with our partners in sort of engineering and other design and planning, we have architects, urban designers, resilience planners, arborists, and horticulturalists on staff. We work. I am based in New York. Laura is, I guess, in our New York office, but actually based in Boston. Our main offices are in New York, New Orleans, and San Francisco. And we have a few folks in other locations like Boston and Atlanta. But our projects are really spread around the US. And if there's one thing that really unites what we do, it is really thinking about landscapes and landscape systems and designing and working with natural and human systems to create thriving landscapes and communities at multiple scales. And for us, and I think what's relevant to Cape Ann is water and this idea of living with water and the work at the land, what we kind of call the land-water interface is really at the heart of our practice. And many of our projects touch that water. We don't think of it as land or water, but really that dynamic landscape between and among. And so innovation at the water's edge is really at the core of our practice, whether we're talking about urban development projects like this China Basin Park that envisions new and changing ways for us to interact with the water in the various environments and communities that we live, or working with communities like this. This is Boston, Resilient Boston Harbor Vision, to really plan and design for a resilient future that thinks about their thriving community both as what's on land and is in water, because so many of our cities and our communities are really tied with the water and the shoreline. But also, we vision, we plan, but we design and build. We are a landscape architecture practice, and are really focused on building what we see as landscape infrastructure. We're building public parks, we're building plazas, but we're also building things like the Living Breakwaters projects, which I'll talk about later, that are infrastructure in our cities, and really important to think about open space as part of that, and also on the same scale as we deal with climate change. And this is, we have received recognition and awards for this work, and I share these not so much to promote that, but to say I hope that qualifies us to share some of our practice and our philosophies with you today, and we hope that it's relevant. And I think that the challenge that we've recognized that we face, that I think you have too in Cape Ann and in Massachusetts and nationally, is that, this is a quote from very famous landscape architect Lawrence Halprin. I think he made this quote in like the 60s or 70s, but it's still true today. Change has become the essential element of our time. We can't design. We can do as many projections as we want, but we're not designing for a predictable, knowable future. We need to sort of live and work in these dynamic systems. And how do we do that? It creates many changes. We talk about it as climate change, but that change has forces for habitat loss, for social inequity. And this is a challenge that we're facing everywhere. It's a challenge that in Massachusetts is recognized, and I think we're going to focus on a number of other projects that I think have informed the work, but wanted to highlight that we're thinking about this and looking at this from the lens of coastal Massachusetts too. We're working with Woods Hole Group on the resilient coast plans for the coastal zone management group in Massachusetts, kind of looking at what is the framework for managing our coastline statewide. We've worked at the neighborhood scale in Boston, but also in Salem, in the El Punto neighborhood, for their Resilient Together program, trying to understand how do you create resilient landscape as well as human systems. And Laura is actually working in Beverly, Mass right now on Lynch Park, which is a park redesign, but as you can see from that photo, is really about how do we create and maintain this open space in the face of really pretty dramatic climate threats, mostly from sea level rise. And so, what is it that we understand that Cape Ann faces in the future are, we talk about climate change and sea level rise, but sea level rise is a process and a trajectory. What does it mean for our experience? And it's really that high tide flooding, that chronic increased tide levels that are flooding us more and more frequently, as well as the coastal storms that we hear more about, the more dramatic events, that both of those tie together, and the coastal erosion that comes with it. I think that's something that many people forget, but I'm sure those of you living on, we have to remind people about coastal erosion, but I think this is probably a conversation, a group where I don't have to remind us of that issue, that this is part and parcel of that. And so, what can design do? What can landscape architecture in particular, but design more broadly do? And as SCAPE, one of the touchstones that we come back to is a monograph of our work. We kind of call it a manifestograph, because it was a little bit of a philosophy, a little bit of projects, and a little bit of interaction and commentary from our partners. But we published this in 2016. But it really, I think, summarizes the way that we look at the landscape and think about the landscape in terms of as a frame for action and activism, as well as a solution for these challenges, and really hope that these spatial and physical tools can really help us, but also partners, communities, citizens conceptualize and then remake our built and natural world, understanding that those are not separate. And we really distilled these three themes of revive, cohabit, and engage. And Laura and I kind of thought we would take this opportunity to highlight what we mean with these and how you might apply these concepts in practice through a lens of our projects. And I would say that we try to do these and touch on these approaches and themes in all of our work. So there should be an element of them in all of the practice. But we'll use a project to kind of emphasize a particular theme. And this is just, I think some of the projects we want to dig into a little more deeply is our work in Nantucket with the Nantucket Land Bank, Living Breakwaters, which you mentioned in Staten Island, Tom Lee Park, which is a large waterfront park in Memphis, and the work with Climate Ready Boston. And beyond. So, first to talk kind of about revive and the concept of reviving landscape processes, I'm going to turn it over to Laura to talk a little bit about Nantucket.
Great, thanks, Pippa. So when we think about the concept of revive, this is really about reviving landscape processes and the systems themselves, but also how we reconnect landscapes with people and with the greater systems in our environments. So Pippa, if you go to the next slide, yes, that's okay. So I'm going to talk about two examples from our work in Nantucket. We've been working, Pippa and I, for a number of years with the Nantucket Islands Land Bank and the town of Nantucket and other stakeholders to look at some of the publicly owned lands especially along the waterfront and the harbor, and think about their potential both to revive ecological systems and also to really connect people. So just, many of you know Nantucket, but for anyone who doesn't, this is the context right off the coast of the Cape. And we're going to be focusing in on downtown, this sort of protected harbor area. I think what's been interesting as we've dug in and gotten to know the land bank and the town better, the Nantucket has so much preserved land. You can see in this diagram, the darker green are parcels that are owned by the Nantucket Islands Land Bank. The lighter green are other preserved lands, many of which are towned lands. And so you can start to see that there's a critical mass, in a way, a kind of system that is possible along the waterfront, but not all of these properties are functioning that way today. Some of them are not well utilized. They're mown. They're not always contributing a lot of ecological value. So we've been working together with the town and the land bank to think about how we can really shape them as a system that is part of both reviving the ecological systems here and part of planning for resilience as Nantucket faces those same, rising sea levels and coastal storms. So I'm going to talk about two projects. If you just flip back for one second.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. I was just going to orient people. So first I'm going to talk about Consu Spring, which is outlined sort of towards the middle of the slide. This is a fragment of marsh right adjacent to downtown that has some access and some hydrologic issues. And then I'm going to second talk about the Washington Street framework, which is really that kind of main corridor that you see highlighted in the south of downtown. Okay, so with that, we'll start with Consu Spring. So Consu Spring is a salt marsh that is really adjacent to the downtown. You can see in the center of this image, there's a causeway. That is actually a raised berm that was constructed as a part of the historic railroad that went along the coast in Nantucket. And it's a remnant. It's now used as a bike trail. And the sort of fact of creating that berm has impounded a wetland behind it. So you see the area called Goose Pond, which used to be hydrologically connected to the salt marsh and now is really actually, if you go to the next slide, I think you start to be able to see some of the conditions. Yeah, this is the causeway on the left. You can see that there are a number of invasive species sort of lining it, and there's really not great access. You can see people. This is our team trying to walk the site. There's no sidewalk. So we're thinking about both the restoration of the marsh itself and getting people to access it. So you could see not great drainage. This is on the part behind the causeway. There's been some sort of ad hoc dredging happening, but not really an ecologically valuable functioning landscape today. On the next one, yeah, you can see the edge along the harbor is actually quite a robust salt marsh. But the inland parts of the site, you can see on the right, really just taken over by knotweed, and there's a lot of Phragmites there. So sort of combating those invasive species has been a challenge. And this is an aerial view. So you can really see that thriving salt marsh to the right side of the image, the causeway going through the middle, and then the area called Kansu Spring over to the left with Goose Pond. This was an area of cultural significance. It's a place where a freshwater spring meets the marsh. It was a significant area in Nantucket's history, but really not a lot of that is visible or accessible on the site today. And so we were thinking about that as we approached the site. And this is a site, like pretty much all of the harborfront in Nantucket that is experiencing flood risk. So you can see the extents of mean high water today. And by 2050, much of the sort of impounded wetland portion will begin to see mean high water, really essentially daily high tides flooding that space. And then by 2070, we have bigger problems in terms of more of the downtown. And so we were trying to think about how through this project, we could both restore the marsh hydrology that has been sort of disrupted in the past, but also think about how what we do here can contribute to the resilience of downtown and the larger plans for coastal resilience that Nantucket has made. So this is an image of the design proposal, and I'm essentially going to walk through and break it down by the systems that are at work here, but you can get the sense that it's about restoring the marsh, about reconnecting the water, and then really bringing people to the water to enable them to access it with a light touch on the land, but in a variety of ways. I think really the generative design process for this site was working closely with our partners at Woods Hole Group to understand what the potential was to reconnect the water. So today there's a culvert, there's insufficient water exchange. So what's happening is the full tide is coming into Goose Pond, but it's not draining. And so that's why the Phragmites are thriving, but other marsh species are not. And so in order to promote a healthy marsh, we need to get that full tidal flush happening. And so we started to sketch some different ideas about how it could be configured. On the next slide, getting into more a kind of detailed model that then Woods Hole Group was able to run both in today's conditions and understanding the long-term sea level rise conditions with various storms, and establishing a really kind of fine grading that would support a salt marsh habitat both today and in the future. And I think what's especially challenging here, maybe with the reviving of this landscape, is that some of the salt marsh species really thrive within just a few inches of topography. And so there's a very careful calibration here of the grades and how we can also set up the marsh to thrive into the future and give it space to migrate as the water rises. So you can start to see here some of the strategies around water, creating an expanded culvert that allows that full tidal flush, creating some linked ponds with more space for stormwater management that serves the town and helps with some of the localized flooding that happens as well. And then that goes hand in hand on the next slide with the restoration of the marsh ecosystem. So with that full tidal exchange, we begin to establish areas for low marsh, high marsh, and transitional marsh that will transform in the future as well as the water rises. And so we've started to think about, with the restoration of that ecosystem, how do we bring people into it with a light touch, but bring people to the edge, really enhancing that major causeway connection that's a critical connection between the regional or the island-wide bike trails and the downtown. And then also thinking about access on all the sides. This is a really busy area of the island, and having sort of safe ways for people to access and just enjoy the site is critical. And on the next slide, I think you can start to see a visualization of just one of those moments sort of at the cusp of the downtown, where you have more of this vocabulary of gardens and how that could transition in from a public space reaching down to the restored marsh, and bringing people together at that location where today really the views are hidden by a wall of Phragmites. And then integrated into this is the resilience planning that the town is doing. I'll talk about this a little bit more in the next project, but the town of Nantucket had worked with Arcadis and a broader team to develop a coastal resilience plan. And part of that identified the causeway in Consu Spring as part of a system of elevated coastal structures. And so we really looked carefully at how we could raise the causeway, but in the near term, allow that tidal water exchange. And there's flexibility for how the system could be adapted in the future as the waters rise. So that was an important part of the project as well. And then I think we have, yeah, just another visualization of being on the causeway with the restored marsh and the access along the edges. So thinking about how to, respect the sort of character and identity, why people love to come here today. It's kind of an incredible vista, but trying to take a light touch while really enhancing the ecologies here. And that's just an overview looking back towards downtown of how this could look in the future with a restored marsh. And so this is really just in a conceptual stage. But I'm going to talk next about Washington Street, which is that northern site. And I think what's different maybe about this site is that it doesn't have the kind of incredible resource of the coastal salt marsh that Consu Spring does. But I think in our work, we still really feel like this connection of people and ecosystem and the water's edge is possible almost, in any condition. And so we're really thinking about how to enhance the shoreline here at downtown. So you can see an image of the site today. A number of the properties along the water between Washington Street and the harbor are town or land bank properties. You can see that houses have actually been removed and moved elsewhere on the island. And so there's sort of an accrual of this waterside land over time. And we've been working with the land bank to think about what's possible here. This is an incredibly important corridor for the island. Pretty much all of the goods that come to Nantucket come from the ferry along Washington Street to the broader island. And all of the transit, the wave shuttles, every single one converges on Washington Street, as well as all of the people that come to town. And so it's just, it's a very low-lying area, but it's very critical as a piece of infrastructure. And you can see here, this is just a map showing all of those converging pieces of transit infrastructure, as well as access to the beach that happens along this edge. So it's really part of the recreational life of the downtown as well. And then on the next one, of course, the flood risk. So we see, today there's flooding, kind of fringe flooding along the beach edge. By 2050, we're looking at a couple of flood pathways that will inundate Washington Street on a daily basis. So this is really an issue that needs to be tackled soon in order to maintain this as a piece of infrastructure serving the island, but also to maintain use of the waterfront in this area. And so, yeah, you can just see that this has been true pretty much at every nor'easter that's happened. Some flooding from 2020, Washington Street underwater, impassable or barely passable. And as I mentioned, the Coastal Resilience Plan identifies kind of an elevated feature along the coast, along the harbor. And so this segment of site that we're looking at along Washington Street is a piece of that. So through the work with the land bank at the town, we're looking at implementing kind of that first elevated piece that will also be part of a system of dunes. We worked through with Woods Hole Group again to identify a flood elevation. This is tricky because people really want to maintain their connection with the water, their views. That's part of why they love to live in Nantucket or visit Nantucket. But at the same time, as we, berm up an edge in order to maintain Washington Street as drier for longer, it's sort of finding that sweet spot in terms of an elevation. So so we can see, we landed at elevation 8, which keeps us essentially above the annual storm in 2070 and aligns with the Coastal Resilience Plan. And you'll see in some of the following images what that will look like. And so this really started out as a resilience framework. We looked at a typological approach, thinking about both the specific vulnerabilities of the parcels that are part of the framework, as well as the opportunities. So thinking about the inland parcels as really serving stormwater management, and the coastal properties, both introducing kind of an elevated dune feature, as well as opportunities for recreation and gathering. And I think this is critical in so many of our coastal site, in any coastal site, thinking about this two-directional issue with water. If you are elevating the edge, we need space inland to hold the water and allow it to be managed until it can flow out. And so these are just an example of some of the different typologies that we illustrated along the Washington Street corridor, all really thinking about a condition today that allows a kind of continuous sort of recreational landscape along the water, but also that can be adapted if it needed to be, if, for example, the elevations needed to be raised in the future, that's considered in the spatial design of these places. Okay, and so this is just an image of the overall framework plan, looking at, this is really a sort of idea of if there were more ability to collaborate across all of these parcels, what could we do? And we also really thought about what's the more immediate kind of phase one implementation of this as well. So you see this area, it highlighted Francis Beach. On the next slide, this is an area that, oh, okay, sorry, we'll come back to that. I'll show just a before and after. So this is Washington Street today. On the next slide, this is what it would essentially look like in 2050 mean high water, daily high tide, if without the project. And so here you start to see this kind of dune landscape, a connection of the bike path. It's actually the same one that goes through Consu Spring, now enters downtown along this elevated bike path, and a beach berm that would allow people to inhabit the beach and sort of continue the way that they love to recreate on the waterfront. And it's really it's a transformation of what has been a fairly privatized, waterfront to a much more piece of public infrastructure that also really rejuvenates that coastal ecosystem with the dune landscape. And so this is a catalytic project where we're looking at, working with the land bank and the town to advance this one in a first piece. Which incorporates both the waterfront elevated feature and viewing decks and beach, as well as those inland stormwater management. So even at the sort of pilot project stage, trying to think about that two-directional system of water. And then these are just a few images visualizing, the beach deck. This would essentially, have the elevated flood structure beneath it, but feel as a continuous piece of kind of a dune and boardwalk landscape that is, hopefully authentic to the Nantucket vernacular. And then on the next slide, this is an image of that inland water feature, stormwater management area that would also, be a gathering space and allow opportunities for education in the landscape and so on. And then that's just a view looking back at that first phase project. So, really thinking about connecting the systems of restored coast, restored hydrology, and networks of people engaging with the water. So I think with that, Pippa, I'm going to hand it to you on cohabit.
Yeah.
Laura, Pippa,
So
if I could
please.
just mention briefly, sorry,
Yeah.
as talking on Nantucket about salt marshes, there's a note in the chat by McIntosh referring people to the Hatches Harbor salt marsh restoration in P-Town on the other cape, by way of example. And I should mention that in addition to the chat function, please share precedents there. We also have a Q&A function. Please begin to populate your questions there. Of course, we'll have time in the fullness of our hour and a half together to engage with your questions through the Q&A chat at the bottom. Thanks.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think with the, cohabit and revive, this kind of concept of cohabit and revive are really intertwined because they're both about sort of the coexistence and ability to engage and live with natural systems and other species as well as each other. And I think what we really wanted to illustrate through Nantucket is, whether you're looking, in a place that is, is it natural or is it urban? Consu much more wild, but a very manipulated environment. But that same principle of really looking to what are the natural hydrologic systems there. But the second part of that is like how do we coexist, right? How do we design for a wide range of people, but also with those ecosystems? So, we can restore the physical systems, but we also have to think about the biological systems and really cohabiting. And to do that, we can't just aspire to it. We need to really think about who and how we're designing for. And I think similarly, the project I want to kind of use to illustrate this is our Living Breakwaters project. And, like in Nantucket, we really were looking at, how do we work with natural systems and make them thriving ecosystems as well as new infrastructure. And while this project is here to kind of illustrate ecological design, its impetus and origin was climate risk and reduction, right? This is a project that came out of the Rebuild by Design competition, which was a design competition in the wake of Hurricane Sandy. We're talking $50 billion worth of damage in the New York metro region associated with loss of life, an incredible disruption, both sort of socially as well and economically as well as physically to the New York region. And at that time, in reaction, people making a lot of maps like the one on the left, the like red, what was damaged, how bad is the water now, and where is it going to be? But I think what we needed to remember was that if not for New York Harbor, then not New York City. Cape Ann has a long shoreline, but New York City is 520 miles of waterfront, and Lower Manhattan has a waterfront, but not all those communities are dense. Lower Manhattan, they're a collection of small coastal communities too, and so we cannot lose what makes our city, our town, our ecosystems, our neighborhoods, what it is in trying to adapt. And so, we looked at those shallow water landscapes where exposed shorelines coexisted with ecosystems and these vibrant waterfront communities, and posited, can we combine risk reduction with culture and ecology, right? That sort of three-part pronged approach. And I'm going to kind of try to give the basis in all three, but really focus on that ecological. What does it mean to design to cohabit? And so the vision for Living Breakwaters was combining the risk reduction enhancement of ecosystems and cultural resilience with this. And this is the concept, and a network or necklace, like you saw in the first drawing of these offshore. This is the conceptual rendering from the competition phase long ago, that we could create these structures that would break waves before they hit shore, but also revive ecosystems and function as healthy, thriving habitats. And the people like this idea and resulted in an award of funding, a large award of funding to the state of New York, who we've been working with, the Office of Resilient Homes and Communities, to implement the project pretty much for the last decade. So as I mentioned, the impetus, the outcome is how do I keep this from happening? Not flooding, we're not going to keep the water out, but because that would be almost insurmountably challenging, but the damage that this area saw was just demolished houses and more gradual erosion over time. And when you start to look at the context, this wasn't unusual, right? This was an exposed, there was a reason this was happening. The New York Bight, which is this area where all those arrows are passing through between Sandy Hook, New Jersey, and the point of the Rockaways, New York, which is basically funneled water in. And the storm surge elevations and the wave action that you saw on the shoreline of Staten Island during Sandy was much higher than other places. But also this long-term gradual erosion. We saw sort of rates of 1 to 3 feet a year of erosion, since the 70s. And it said, why? But this, why was this happening? It made sense. But this wasn't always the case. As we started looking back at historic maps, this wasn't this is an active, a sort of wide, shallow bay, but with these massive dredge channels. The main shipping channel of New York comes through. But historically, before European settlers and when they early settled, this was a wide reach of mudflats and marshes and oyster reefs. These through this sort of bank area, the teal were sort of the main documented concentrations of oyster beds, and you have these sort of historic documentation of the area. This is offshore of the town, the area that we're talking about, Tottenville. To the extent that so you have these historic beds, it was such an economic resource and a driver. Actually, the what was a town, now a neighborhood in New York City, that where the breakwaters are located. There's a book about it that is called actually Tottenville, the town the oyster built, because the oystering economy was so fundamental to the foundation and operation of that town. And so you actually saw the beds expand after European settlement as they were building this. But those populations were decimated in the early 1900s because of overharvesting, but also more importantly, because of dredging and fill and the sort of sediment in the water, as well as just water quality, largely dumping raw sewage into the thing. So today we don't really have those oysters. And we all accept it as a loss of a sort of cultural icon, but and an ecosystem. But what research has shown is it actually increase the vulnerability. You know, you had these sort of massive structured shallow water habitats that waves and storm surge were breaking across. And research has now shown that, you know, that actually left the shorelines more exposed and can be linked to that erosion and damage. So we said, what if we can't, you know, we can't go back and build acres and miles of oyster reef, they're not going to say, but can we revive those ecosystem functions, right? And so from the physical standpoint, I'll just, you know, we are talking about coastal resilience and storms. So, you know, the idea of creating breakwaters, which break waves, and we modeled this. Are they going to break down storm waves? Are they going to modify wave action such that we can build back the shore? And we iterated this with computer models. We tested, do they structurally work? Can they hold up, right? So we're building that physical thing. But what about the ecological thing, right? It's not enough to say that we want them to physically function like oyster reefs. How do we physically design something that biologically functions like an oyster reef? And we start with a very logical place for designers, right? Everyone's like, how do we do ecological design? Well, who are we designing for? It just means we're not designing only for people. We need to sort of identify who it is. And so a big part of the project was working with our ecologists. It wasn't this idea that, oh, they sort of look like oyster reefs. It's what did those oyster reefs historically provide? They were, you know, the oysters were food for people, for other fish, but more importantly, they're what we called habitat forming species that aggregated and formed these reefs that were complex structured, that supported modal benthic invertebrates like crabs and lobsters that could scurry around on the bottom. There were structure-oriented fish that really kind of fed on smaller forage fish that could hide in the crevices, that they created these rich ecosystems. The reefs were ecosystems. And so we needed to sort of identify and group all these species of like who we are designing for. And the reality when you start to do that, sounds very complex, is there's actually some basic principles that span across a lot of reef ecosystems. We were looking specifically at the species in the harbor we might support, but one of the key things is really just this creating complexity. The other things is that you see is that in reef formations across the world, this is what they call spur and groove formation. So we're really designing, so how can we design that similar structure, which we termed reef streets? So from a design perspective, we were really sort of systematically thinking how we could modify and manipulate the design of a structure that still provided that wave breaking component, but did it in a way that added, you know, avoided critical habitat, sort of minimized the footprint and disturbance, but also increased that surface area, the larger scale complexity, the smaller scale complexity, and then ultimately even installing oysters on them. And so this is sort of the later, you know, this is a more technical drawing from that competition photo that represents sort of the final design with those reef streets and the different sized rock and aggregates that is actually under construction right now. Construction began in 2021. It's been proceeding. We should finish up this year. This is the necklace of breakwaters. You can see those reef street structures sticking out, right? And so we're building in these ecological components. It's mostly sort of rock. It has that structural complexity, but that these elements like these artificial tide pools, water retaining elements that create intertidal habitat, these subtidal ecological structures, which were able to kind of increase surface area and create surface complexity that appeals to more size fish. And then just the groups, you can see the reef streets and the different things. And so the question is, you know, we will be monitoring this and looking at it and understanding the success. That'll start at the end of construction. But anecdotally, these are all pictures from our active construction site. You know, we are seeing communities in the tide pools. We are seeing, this is in the middle, a little juvenile striped bass. And, you know, the contractors call us up and say, you got to come and inspect the base layer because there's just stuff growing all over it so fast. You won't be able to see if we built it right, right? And our our bald eagle, and perhaps the most iconic one is our resident harbor seal. And it's not just the seal. I've actually been out there and seen like 6 seals at once. But when we did the renderings, people were like, why are you putting that in? But it was like, this is, if you create, this is what was there. If you create the haul out locations, if you create a place where fish are going to gather and feed, they're going to come. And so we have those different trophic levels, those different animals, and we'll monitor it as it goes on. But it really came from that commitment to cohabiting and thinking through, who are we designing for and how do we design for that biodiverse and complex community. But there's the people side of it too, right? When we're designing to cohabit, it is about helping people understand and be excited about the habitat that's there, but understand what that habitat is. And so there was a lot of engagement around the design and how it would perform throughout. A lot done through our partnership with the Billion Oyster Project, who is a group that will restore oysters on the breakwaters once the structures are complete, but who also use the harbor and restoration activities as a learning and teaching tool for this, right? And so the breakwaters and the presence of these species and ecosystems on them is actually helping foster a generation of educators and stewards. And I think this is a transition to sort of talking about this on a broader scale with some of our other work, but I'll leave this quote from Pete Malinowski, founder of the Harbor School, up, because I think it really is part of being able to cohabit and design for nature is actually inspiring and exciting people to be more aware and advocate for and steward that.
Okay.
That starts with kids.
So building on that, I'm going to talk a little bit about our approach to engagement, which, when we say engage, we often hear this about as a stage of the design process, and that's certainly an important part of the work. But we're really thinking about it as a way that people are engaging with ecology and in this case, the water and the landscape, and then how there's a life that lives on, beyond implementation, where there's opportunities for education in these spaces that we're designing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Tom Lee Park. So we're going from the coast to the river. This is a 31-acre park on the Mississippi River in Memphis, Tennessee. The design here includes a destination playground, outdoor classrooms, art installations, water play features, and so on. And, is really about transforming a fairly underutilized waterfront park to a space that really draws and reflects the communities that it serves. And so, really from the beginning, inclusivity has been a really important part of our approach here. You can see in the map on the right that the park sits kind of right at downtown along the Mississippi in Memphis, but also at the cusp of some of the poorest and most affluent neighborhoods. And so we really wanted to think about the park as a nexus, a place where people could come together and really see themselves in the park, and that it would be a place that's a common ground for all. And so part of this, you can see through, this is recent opening of the park, really throughout the process, it focused on sort of radical welcoming. So this is an example of some of the kind of cultural activities that happened at the opening. It included a brass band, a gospel choir, an outpouring of civic pride, I would say. And the next image shows some of that too. This was kind of a parade where people came from uphill on the bluff down this first accessible trail, the first place you could get down to the river with no steps, and kind of welcomed into the park, and really just the feeling of a shared achievement in the accomplishment of this park. And so here, you can see on the left the image of the park before. A lot of mown grass, not a lot of activity. And it was once actually a city dump, and it's really been kind of restored as a regional destination. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that means in terms of engagement. And so, the kind of basis of the park, it really centers on the history of Tom Lee, who was a Black river worker who became a hero. He risked his own life to rescue 32 white people who had fallen in a capsized steamboat. And so the design of the park is intended to celebrate this legacy of generosity, even in the face of discrimination, and also still surface some conversations about justice in the landscape. So on the next slide, there were actually two art pieces that were commissioned from Black artists that are a part of the park, a part of the way that people engage with the park. This one is called A Monument to Listening, and it's a series of 32 basalt seats that honor those 32 lives that Tom Lee saved. And it's really envisioned as a space to hold dialogue, to think about relationship to one another, and to think about the sort of legacy of justice in the park. Then another really beautiful piece that was commissioned, this is called Democratic Experiment. This was a transformation of the basketball court into a mural. And this was dedicated to Tyree Nichols, which is a Black man in Memphis who was fatally assaulted by the police. And so really, I think these art pieces, as well as the sort of strategies around engagement, were looking to really welcome Black culture and instill remembrance in the park as a symbol that everyone belongs here, and that this is a space for the people. You can also see in the next image some just images of the ways to engage, the ways that kids and people of all ages can come and play in the park, really trying to spark a sense of joy and inclusion. And then on the next slide, the other piece is really engaging with the river and with the ecology of the river. This is kind of always a part of our work, I would say. And so, you can see in the upper plan, the design is organized into different zones that speak to the dynamic hydrology of the Mississippi River in their forms and in their sort of plant communities. And it weaves the circulation and topography to highlight these riparian ecosystems. And you can sort of see how that manifests in a very layered landscape in the bottom image, many ways to engage with the river. And then a big piece of this is also restoring the soils, and along with that, supporting an urban canopy that didn't really exist here before. So this is a very sort of biodiverse network of trees, shrubs, grasses, perennials, and all of these really importantly being climate adaptive, knowing that Memphis is experiencing more and more heat, and also more flashy flooding, and that the species here need to be able to withstand that. And so, a way of engaging as well is this creation of an outdoor classroom. This is a space that was designed called the Pollinator Lab, that was specifically trying to create more intimate spaces for people to experience the relationships between plants and insects. And sort of this idea actually got expanded. If you go to the next slide, Pippa, we at SCAPE were able to create a curriculum that built on learning with the landscape. So engaging students in Memphis with these natural systems that are at work in the park. And it's very excitingly now folded into all of the Memphis school curriculum for 3rd and 9th graders. We actually had a curriculum that we developed with Living Breakwaters as well. So this is something that is a thread in our work that we'd be happy to talk more about. I'm trying to go fast so we don't, so we have lots of time for questions. But Pippa, yeah, you can close us out with scale.
Yeah, so I think one of the concept of scale is, how do we take all these things and put them together? But also, how do you design across scales, integrate the human natural systems and create landscapes that adapt over time? I think the other thing when we think about scale is how do you take these big ideas and big plans and put them into action, set them on a pathway to implementation, but also, make sure that implementation is scaling back up and contributing to your aspirational goals. And one of the sort of Massachusetts-based examples that we, as Laura and I were thinking about, how do we talk about this, is the work that we did with the city of Boston. And I think Boston was really exemplary in the wake of Sandy because it wasn't hit as hard as some of the areas that we've seen here in New York and New Jersey, but they took proactive action to prepare for climate change, right? And really sort of said, how do we start doing this as a city, and organizing their own government structures and plans around that. And it started with a plan that Laura and many others worked on. I did not, but called Climate Ready Boston, right? So it was a very action, stating the problem, stating the challenge, and making that commitment, and really understanding what the possible climate threats are and the range of strategies and actions that might help Boston adapt. And the plan identified, these 5 themes as well as 11 individual strategies to do that work. One of the things that we did work with the city on after they realized we have this big planning document, but how do we show and visualize and envision what we mean that to be for the city? And so really kind of established this resilient harbor vision, which thought about this unification. And for Boston, it really was about, in some ways like holding the line, making sure that this historic city was not flooded, and that making a resilient, protective waterfront, but not having that sacrifice, that accessibility and the lasting relationship with the water kind of was going to create a new waterfront of the future. But the other thing, in addition to that sort of strategy as a unifying vision, was they said, how do we scale that down? How do we put that into action, right? So they really said, we're going to implement this. We're going to work this out, set this out as neighborhood scale plans. And you should, I think it's a good example to look at as a city, and how do we scale this down to these individual places and neighborhoods. And we had the fortune and opportunity to work on Climate Ready Dorchester. Dorchester is Boston's largest neighborhood, its most diverse neighborhood. It has a very long coastline, but sort of different than many of the other coastlines within the city. It is a little less hardened, but pretty much in a lot of industrial and infrastructure, but also these sort of wild, soft edges. And one of the first things we did, our partners at Woods Hole Group, who we work with a lot in this area, was look at, what is the flood risk today, tomorrow, and both that sort of near-term flooding as well as that event-based flooding and long into the future. And what we saw, in Dorchester, there's very distinct kind of areas of flood pathways where large inland areas that actually didn't experience or have great access to the water were really some of the most at risk, and really shared this risk analysis, but also had a number of listening sessions through community workshops with the community to really distill the priorities and what this plan needed to do for Dorchester, not in isolation, but in the context of, what that neighborhood and community and set of communities needed to thrive, right? So this idea of resilience, I think we often equate resilience with risk reduction, but it's not about just protecting from flooding. It's enabling my community not just to survive, but to thrive, to be a place that I actually want to live and can live and work and healthily and safely, despite the fact that climate change and coastal flooding is happening. And so these themes that were there was to do that risk reduction equitably, to do it in a way that enhanced access and mobility instead of, as a lot of infrastructure in this neighborhood had done, actually bypassing them or cutting them off, to promote the health of valuable ecosystems that were remaining, and to really give an identity to the waterfront that had been sort of had its back turned on. And so we really worked with the community members and the city to really understand what these different community assets were and how they were at risk. And so rather than just kind of going straight to a plan, it was this framing of the aspirations that resilience had for this community in terms of this wide range of actually publicly owned land, largely by the state, and open space that was really cut off from the communities, and that the same sort of points of access coincided with flood pathways. And so could that be a catalyst for change, right? Investment in improved access could be coupled with investment in flood risk reduction to achieve both goals holistically. And so that sort of resilience vision was a vision for the shoreline, but was actually sort of this idea of the Dorchester, the shoreway. And so created some of these sub areas and sub compartments based on those flood pathways that allowed us to scale down those visions and think about how we make this happen in the very unique different spaces on this varied shoreline, but actually fed back up into that larger aspiration. And I'm just going to look quickly at two. The first was the Neponset River waterfront, where there was this really extensive salt marsh. And this goes back sort of where you want to test these ideas. One of the things we found, we were able to do modeling with Woods' whole group was able to model some of these things. And we said, well, you know what, it's ecologically important to revive and sustain this marsh, because otherwise with sea level rise, it will be drowned. What if we did that? And what we found is that that actually not only reduced wave damage and waves as sort of common knowledge, but actually reduced the extent of storm surge in some pretty significant storms, such that it made the difference between flooding a transit station and not. And so it's a really big opportunity to do that. We said, well, what if you actually did this at the scale of all these watersheds, which aren't even owned by Boston? They're in Milton, they're in Quincy. If we could start to think at the scale of an estuary. So sort of taking this down and making it specific actually opened up new opportunities. And we've recently partnered with the Neponset River Watershed Association, the trustees of reservations, and Woods Whole Group on a NIFWIF grant, which they were awarded last year, to study this at the scale of the three communities. And so I think taking these ideas and scaling them back up to the larger systems is really key. We've also been working with the city of Boston at Tinian Beach, which I think is another, and Laura, maybe you want to just walk through it really quickly to close us out here. But this idea of really taking things to the next step and taking that first catalytic scaled project.
Yeah, so this is one of those key areas of a flood pathway, as well as a significant piece of open space at the waterfront that was fairly underutilized. And so we zoomed in, from the Climate Ready Dorchester process into a design project at Tinian Beach. And this is just looking at the impact that this site can have on a flood pathway, both in the near term and then thinking about it as a greater system of strategies in the long term. And so we've had the opportunity to do schematic design with the city of Boston on Tinian Beach. This is achieving the sort of flood risk reduction of elevating this segment, while also, again, enhancing access and recreational use and understanding with the community all of the things that people love about this space. So again, this is really a pilot project that we're trying to take, lessons learned here, zooming into one of these flood pathways, and then we can, again, scale it back out and think about how we adapt some of the other pieces of the Dorchester waterfront in the future. And another important piece of this project, we did schematic design, but we really, a key deliverable was setting the city up for grant funding. So they really have a whole kind of matrix of the grants that they're going to pursue, and they have a good sense of next steps towards implementation with the work. So the hope is that this sort of pilot can be realized as a piece of that broader Dorchester strategy.
Yeah. So with that, we want to just open it up for questions and discussion. And thank you. Thank you so much for having us and letting us talk about this.
Thank you both. Thank you, Laura, for it's really inspirational body of work. And this is only just the tip of the iceberg. Is that the metaphor? It's just touching on the portfolio that's growing and ongoing. I think I do want to encourage everyone to participate in the Q&A. Please feel free to populate your questions, and we'll get to them. I think, in my experience in these questions, especially around climate adaptation, resilience planning, especially in the US, especially in the Northeast, there can be a tendency to sort of stay at the large scale, to stay at the scale of the problem or the variety of problems. Right? Mm-hmm. Sea level rise, ocean warming, storm event, land subsidence, increased storm activity in events, and all of those can often leave one, kind of paralyzed in the face of the enormity of the challenge, right? I think we see in your work, we see it in our work, that virtually every aspect of, civil society will in some ways already be or will be shortly touched by questions of climate and adaptation. And that as society transforms, often there's a desire to stay at the level of policies for all or questions of planning at the larger scale of the ecosystem. And one of the things I find so compelling about your work and about the potential for landscape architecture is the ability to intervene materially and spatially, to rebuild habitat, to rebuild community, to provide both protection, risk mitigation, but also the kind of resilience that you describe through intervening through built work. And your practice, among other practices, I think does a great job. It's really exemplary in crossing those scales and just in this short presentation, you were able to illustrate how a regional plan might be devoted to something at the scale of a neighborhood, to something of an intervention at the scale of a park, down to the scale of a certain species of fish or mollusk. I mean, that's really quite remarkable. My question to open really has to do with the nature of that scalar set of choices, right? You've been showing work in environments where the crenellated coastline is quite enormous. You know, Cape Ann has quite a vast coastline with respect to its population. And many of the projects you've shown have something similar. So how do you think about in your work going about identifying, well, where to intervene if you are to intervene? And is that in some ways related to your clientele? And I want to get to a question about your clients because that's also an interesting side of it. But let's just open there. The contrast or tension between large scale plans and scale of intervention, and how do we decide, you know, who gets protected, who gets first moving access to these kinds of innovative projects?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm glad that you acknowledge and recognize that and made that comment about scale, because I think that's something that we're really committed to, that often we are siloed by scales or siloed between sort of built work practitioners and planners. And it needs to be a dialogue, right? We need plans that actually generate and inform projects, but we need projects that are looking back and checking that they're building towards a larger vision. And so your question is very apt. So how do we decide where that project is? You know, I think in an ideal scenario and the way that we do a lot of our plans, most of our resilience and adaptation plans suggest or recommend or request the client that they involve a catalytic project, a first phase project, as Laura kind of illustrated at Tinian Beach. And sometimes that's about, you know, setting it's an underlying sort of foundational thing that's required for other things. Other times it's about testing an idea. We're talking about a lot of natural and nature-based features, and the reality of those type of systems is that they require adaptive management, and that they're not new. There's not some hundreds, you know, a couple hundred years of engineering history and 5 different technical manuals on them. There's like a couple of like research papers. And so to get them built, to get them permitted is actually very challenging. And so you just need to do something. You need to implement a pilot, monitor it, and have that inform, and that needs to be part of the timeline. So for whatever reason, the third is people are tired of plans. If you're in a community that is seeing coastal erosion or just got hit by a storm, like do something that's better. If you just have a plan and you're not implementing a project, even if it isn't addressing all, if we try to wait to figure everything out to address the whole thing, like we can't, right? You know, we need to give people like hope. And so those are reasons to act and how to act. I think in an ideal situation.
It's well put. And it's among the challenges, as you know, that we face, right? So on the one hand, we have no shortage of science. In my experience, I see this in your work as well. We have plenty of information. We have great partners. You mentioned several. And at the same moment, there can often be a desire to just wait until we have more information in the fullness of time. Right. That's right.
Reality.
And I think what you've shown is the importance of, like, we have to act, even if we have to act in ways that are incremental or partial. With respect to your clientele, I mean, you've presented projects that I'm aware of that include a competition started by a private foundation, admittedly one with some resources, and then supported by a state and a governor's office. Another project mobilized through a city and its municipal planning departments and its park department. Maybe in the other cases, maybe with Nantucket and Tom Lee Memphis, can you say something about the clientele and the mix of public, private, and in particular, the role of private philanthropy in this work?
Yeah, I think, and Laura, jump in, but I think for Tom Lee and for Living Breakwaters, private philanthropy was critical, but really in the pre-design phase, in the early conceptualization and the framing and development of goals and ideas and concepts, because it's very hard to either convince a public agency that you know, something that big or visionary is worth it, that it is worth taking the risk, or if they even can take the risk, or it's not going to be so expensive, because there's not really a lot of public resources out there for that early concept development. They're like, oh, we know the problem, like it's a linear process. And we, as you know, designers, planners, we know that's not really how things happen. And so I think you've hit on a really good point that's very important. to have some early investment. And increasingly, we are seeing that come from public funding. I think particularly some of the federal, and I say that to a lot of nonprofit organizations looking for that investment, looking for early planning investment, looking for resources for engagement, because with things like the Infrastructure Reconstruction Act, you'll see a lot of the federal agencies that got funding have sort of new granting requirements. They've eliminated their match requirements. They're meeting Justice 40 to work with disadvantaged communities. They're designating funding for pre-design and development. And so I say, like, look for that. It's that is changing, but it still takes, an investor or a champion, right? And I think that sort of idea of someone who's crafting that narrative and an investment in the idea that can help you figure out how to put money behind it is important. In Tom Lee Park, it's a public park, but it does have a conservancy, and it was the concerted effort, of that conservancy and of a very, I think, inspired leadership there that did that. But I also don't want to overemphasize that, because I think, the public agencies and commitment from elected officials and agencies to structure themselves around resilience and create cost-cutting connections. I mean, you've seen that in New York City with the Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency and Environmental. Sorry, they've changed their names a couple times, but they've stood this up. Even our DEP, stormwater management, has now set like a designated division for climate resilience. Boston did that too, right? In terms of making the climate ready Boston plan and rolling that out. We just finished a resilience plan for the city of Jacksonville. And they have a new mayor, but even under their old mayor, who was a Republican, hired an ex-Obama administration and city of New Orleans person to be their chief resilience officer, because they recognize, like, we're in Florida. Like, this is not a like partisan issue. We need to adapt. And so we are seeing, I think, thinking about how governance structures work. And that's something we look for in our clients when we're working with the city, is that they're showing that commitment, through their leadership, and their governance structures.
I would just add, in Nantucket, it's been a really interesting client consortium, because I think the land bank is technically a public entity, but they have a certain degree of flexibility to sort of plan and design their own land. They answer to their commission. They are partnered with the city, and then Envision Resilience, which has a Remain Nantucket arm, has also been a funder of some of the more community-facing parts of the work. And so, I think for us, that it's a fascinating client group to work with that really has intentionally brought together these entities that have complementary skill sets. There are many times where, it's town infrastructure, but they don't necessarily have the bandwidth to manage the project, but the land bank has the staff. And so there's ways that they can actually complement each other. And I think through some of these projects are pilots, not only for the type of design and how that gets permitted and all that, but it's also a pilot for how these different entities can work together towards these kind of shared goals.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I mean, it exemplifies my own experience, in which it's true, increasingly municipalities, state budgets, planning processes, the federal government are involved and are available for larger scale projects. But the origin of many of these things are quite unique and specific. It's been my experience across, especially the United States, some mix of civic leadership. It takes various forms. Sometimes it's a not-for-profit, sometimes it's an advocacy group, sometimes it's a community group, sometimes it comes from some mix of private philanthropy. But to be open to that, because it takes different forms in every locale. We're going to now pivot to the Q&A from our audience, and so maybe we could stop the share.
Sure.
Thanks for that. And a couple of the questions have to do with the nature of this question of public versus privateness. You mentioned, with respect to the Nantucket example, a beach that had become privatized at a moment in time, or was had the implication of not being publicly available, becoming more publicly available. So a couple of the questions deal with, in these contexts, we're looking at ecosystems that used to be connective. You now see infrastructure cutting through them, in which much of the shoreline, much of the water's edge has been privatized or is privately owned. So is there a way that you approach that question when the water's edge is spoken for by people who own it privately and expect to use it?
Yeah, this is a really, really tough challenge. And I think for me, one of the examples of our work that has been most relevant is the place where we didn't touch the water line, which is living breakwaters, because it was a lower density for New York residential area. And the shoreline was part of Conference House Park. It was part of a park, but the park kind of had two long nodes. And those beaches have been privatized. The neighborhood used them, but the people who lived most adjacent to the beach sort of had this attitude that it was their backyard and had literally actually encroached in public right of way in many instances. And so, while in many ways, while the larger neighborhood and people who use the beach really were early supporters and advocates for the project, some of the people who are detractors were the ones who lived right there, whose houses in many ways were the most at risk, partly because it was this idea that they liked the privatized beach. And I think one of the things that we have to grapple with, particularly on the coastline and particularly on these sort of very exposed and erosive shorelines, is just change. I think the biggest challenge one of the biggest challenges that we face is resistance to change. And so for living breakwaters, but I think this was also true through, in Nantucket, a lot of the visualizations that we start with are, no action. Because everybody thinks if I don't do anything, it will stay the same. And one of the realities, particularly in our coastal environments, even without climate change, this is a dynamic environment, it would just change. Like change is one of the most certain and only certain things. So this idea of starting from a place of really understanding like that my land, my landscape, and my relationship to the water is going to change even when I'm not there, like if we don't do anything. And so you're going to need to balance those trade-offs. The
Pippa,
other part
I think
is
you coined a new term, a NIMBY, and not in my backyard beach.
yeah.
I mean, I mentioned this in part because we've seen this across work across the United States, in which, yes, of course, we think this is publicly accessible, but of course, people have a proprietary interest in it because of proximity, right? We've lived here for generations. We think it's ours. You showed the example of the sidewalk, right? And I've been working in many contexts where the last thing people want is sidewalk or access, less on that parking lot. And so is there a tension, or can there be a tension between this notion of access? Many of the projects you pointed to, increased access, getting down to the water's edge, being able to, access for different populations, and this notion that, well, private property rights, especially in this part of the world in New England, are quite closely held.
It's a real challenge, but I think you're going to navigate it differently. I think one of the things that, and Laura, I think we can think about this in the context of Nantucket and Tinian Beach, is that really being able to talk to people about the different options they have, but also that it's not tomorrow. I think one of the big failings in a lot of our resilience adaptation planning, and it is urgent. Like a big storm could happen tomorrow and your house could be obliterated, and you need to understand that. But the reality is a lot of this is going to happen gradually. It's going to gradually erode. I'm not saying like move out of your house tomorrow or we need to do this like the next day, but what can we talk about how you can adaptively manage your landscape over the next 5 years, over the next 10 years? If you're old, can we talk about like maybe it stays the way it is for now, but don't bequeath it to your children, and we can do something different with it. So then, and that's one of the things that we've been looking at, in Nantucket, is a really interesting model, because like that's really what they're doing. Like people are coming to them, the land bank, like, hey, do you want to acquire my property? And Laura, you can speak more to this, but like one of the things that was really interesting is the land bank had a specific mission and rationale for acquiring property that had to do with like ecological value and public recreational value. And as we started doing work with them, we started identifying sort of to give it a term, like properties they should probably be looking at in terms of managed retreat, like where you are going to have a lot of coastal inundation. And, literally while we were doing the Washington Street project, right, there were a lot of people, the waterfront parcels were very clear. Oh, they're going to get flooding. And we started looking at some, as I think we've all seen now with the extreme rain, like it's false to think it's only coming from the ocean, because as as our inland areas can't drain, you have these really at-risk areas. And a number of these properties started to pop, and we were like, well, yeah, we'd really love to create a stormwater management park there. And they were like, oh, that we never thought that was relevant, but those people just literally approached us about acquiring that property before. So it's one of the only projects where you were like, we kind of
It
lived
is
out that. Like,
interesting.
oh,
It is
they
interesting
literally
how in
bought
these
the property while we
pendulated
were
coastlines, it was so interesting in these the non-linear, the non-obvious, right? So we've been doing on Cape Ann for a couple of years work on the natural ecosystem, but also looking at filled land. You know, I mean, it's not a bad surrogate for where things we know will flood,
Right.
and it's not obvious. It's not just coastal adaptation. You've mentioned and referenced in the work 2030, 2050, 2070. Those are the dates around which we're building our work through the Office of Urbanization. Among the questions in the Q&A is, are all of your projects looking at 2070, 2050, 2030 as horizons?
Yeah, I can start, Pippa. You'll have a nuanced version of this, but I'm thinking about that example. I showed that chart for our work in Nantucket with the 2030, 2050, 2070. And I think this is something I've really learned working with our partners at Woods Hole Group is, you know, it's not some single fixed event that you're planning for, right? It's you're trying to thread the needle where if you're creating an elevated landscape, for example, well, it has benefit, you know, for a storm in 2070 and, you know, mean high tide beyond that. And what our colleague, you know, Kirk Bosmo says is, well, if it happens slower, that's great. You know, it's just like there's no, you know, there's no perfect moment in time that we can look to. There's so much unknown. So we can take the data that we have and synthesize that and understand that there's going to be different levels of impact at different times in the
I mean,
future.
speaking to the Halpern quote you opened with, right? I mean, we're talking about the context of change, and the fact that there's no end date also makes it quite difficult. I mean, what we say in our work often is that individuals and institutions are already making choices. You know, if you look at reinsurance markets or you look at property values more broadly or questions of inheritance and land banking, individuals, municipalities, institutions are already making choices vis-a-vis climate risk. And at the same time, of course, given that there's no fixed horizon, we have this condition often of differential motivations, right, on different time horizons, right? The development community are developing and moving their money in and out of projects within a decade. People are, you know, securing 30-year mortgages, many of them still even at these higher interest rates. And in that place, the differential incentives vis-a-vis timelines can be quite challenging. A couple of the questions that have come up have to do with gentrification. One of the questions, of course, that I know is central to our work in research is the relationship between building landscape amenity or rebuilding ecosystem habitat and health or providing access and producing gentrification or gentrifying environments. And do you have thoughts about that topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I can speak to this, and it has to go hand in hand with policy that provides that protection, right? Because the reality is, you know, we could just eliminate, you know, we can make it only possible for people who are super wealthy to live in these areas. And so I think this is where this sort of planning holistically comes in, that, you know, we need to think holistically about the areas outside the floodplain as well as in the floodplain, and look at our communities really as holistic places where people live and work, and as well as the ecosystems. And so there's no right or wrong answer or one way to do it. If you don't proactively make policy to preserve safe, affordable housing for people, you will not get it. And I say safe, affordable housing because I'm not saying, I mean, in New York City, we have public housing on barrier islands and they flood and they can't move people out of the bottom floors because there's nobody's building public housing, right? So I'm not advocating for protecting every low income housing that's in a floodplain. I'm saying we need to think holistically about where we're supplying and providing affordable housing. And that's why we need to kind of be working. Like I'm not a housing expert or a planner, but I know that needs to be part of a holistic resilience plan for.
But you're exactly right, Pippa, to connect resilience planning, climate adaptation, particularly in coastal communities, to questions of housing. Like we've seen on our work in Cape Ann, on the one hand, a great need already, even current day, steady state. The need for affordable housing, the need even for more market rate housing, for example, and yet at the same moment, a real anxiety, let's say, or a set of anxieties around changing the nature of the environment, changing the nature of the built experience, et cetera. We have a cluster of questions, all of which I could summarize in having to do with how to work in environments that have not one strong governor or one strong mayor, but rather a series of smaller municipalities. Do you see models, in which smaller communities can form a coalition or work together? And then, as a continuation of that, what about the fact that these smaller towns typically will have smaller staffs, smaller in-house capacities for this kind of work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Laura, you probably have a lot of examples here, but one that just jumps into mind that I want to speak to is you should look at the Resilient New Jersey program. We've worked in New Jersey for a number of years, and one of the things that saw as a real problem in the wake of Sandy was they're a home rule state, and they're a lot of small communities that faced a couple of different challenges. One was the sort of my whole town is in the floodplain, so I can't, and we're home rule, so literally my tax base is there, so I just have to rebuild stuff in the floodplain, because if I can't, I don't have commercial tax revenue that funds my schools. But the other was, hey, here are 3 towns with like part-time, one part-time like city planner, like how am I going to do this? And so at the state level, primarily New Jersey DEP did kind of create coalitions and these regions, these resilience regions, where they funded and supported, they had designated DEP staff, but funded and supported technical assistance to a number of these different communities. And we worked with Arcadis in one of them in Raritan River and Bay communities, but they had some in Barnegat Bay and in Atlantic City area as well. But that was true. It's just like, there's Clark, there's Rahway, there's a number of different things in Middlesex. Like there were just a lot of small towns that were able to kind of come together and have a seat at the table. And part of that was, that took state leadership, but there was also designated nonprofit partners. In that sense, it was the YMCA, because they were like a regional nonprofit that had contacts and connections and space in each of the communities.
It's a great example of this non-obvious where leadership comes from on these topics. I think one of the things that we've seen clearly is that our existing, both government but also civic structures have capacity often, but are not aligned to this set of challenges, right? It's a cliche to say government policy, legislation is usually retrospective, right? It's looking at the last battle, as it were. The cluster of questions have come in having to do really with this question of engagement. Who's engaged? You've referred in the presentation to engaging citizenry in a variety of ways. What we used to call citizen science, I'm now meant to call civilian science, to not stigmatize those without paperwork. So on the one hand, we've seen living breakwaters, the idea of having school children out there, engaged in the water. You've talked about engagement vis-a-vis the use and activity and programming of these places. On the topic of engagement, are there tensions between, engaging or talking with community, let's use that term, and the future of their communities or their neighborhoods versus the notion of piloting something? Obviously, that's something you've touched on in your presentation so far, but we wonder if, I've seen it in my own work, I can use it as an example. Often there is the sense that the political leadership, the elected and appointed officials, are working very hard in very difficult contexts, and they've basically devolved to the designing classes the responsibility to organize civil society. Is that too strong a reading? I mean, I see that often where basically designers are invited in to organize what otherwise historically had been the responsibility of elected and appointed officials.
I think we try to be really intentional from the beginning in setting out what are the goals of engagement, and really having a clear discussion with the client group, with the team, with the stakeholders who are guiding the process about what are the decisions that are going to be made based on our technical analysis. What are the decisions that are going to be made because of political will and the important, the goals of the people who are running the process? And then what are the things that we want to know from the community? And I think if we can ask honestly about the things that we need input on, it tends to go better. When we open it to give us your feedback on everything, but actually that there are things that are determined already, it gets confusing and people lose trust. And so I think it's important, to make those connections so that people see their vision and themselves in the spaces that we're designing. But it's really about kind of setting the framework for how their feedback is being used. I saw the question in the chat too about, what comes first, listening or visioning? And I mean, I think this speaks to the same thing. I think that there's a moment of level setting where you need to listen, you need to understand where people are coming from, sometimes the challenging relationships they've had with whoever's, governing this process in the past, and set the groundwork for how their feedback is going to be used genuinely in the process.
I think that honesty and transparency is so key. And one of the things we talk about with a lot of like clients or partners early on is like, how much are you investing in engagement? And if they don't want to invest, and I mean, I don't just mean like money, but also just time on their part, because just be honest about that. If you can't afford it, if you're not going to do it, if you don't have the staffing, then we're going to have a different strategy, right? But that honesty and establishing that trust is just so key, because that's where these projects really break down, is when people think something's going to happen that doesn't.
Mm. And there's a long history of that, as you know, in design and planning. And I mean, among the first things that we learn in design school these days are the sins of our grandparents, right? Not to repeat those histories. Maybe that's a good place to pause. Thank our audience. Sarah, do you want to close us out with mentioning the Cape Ann Conversation series and where people can find out more?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you all so much for joining, and thank you, Laura and Pippa, for the great presentation and then this like very vibrant discussion. It's been great. And so I'll go ahead and encourage everyone in the audience to check out more of SCAPE's work. I'll include their website in the chat, and then also to check out some of the past iterations of the Cape Ann Conversation on a separate site. So thank you so much.
Laura, Marett, Pippa, Brashear, thanks so very much for joining us.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us.
Stay well.
See you later.